Today is the 24th day of January 2018, year 10 of Pirkei Avot study. And as I said, I mentioned it in one of my Shabbos emails, which gets between 35 and 40% of the people who are sent it open. Right, which is, I guess, not too bad. I mean, I only pour my life into it, but that's okay. If you don't want to read what's on my mind.
Open and play.
That is true. Right, I get very few clicks, like two clicks.
What's a click?
Click means they don't have to open it to be able to read it.
Oh, well, I get very few clicks on constant content, but I get about 35% to 40%. The Baruch Diana Mets get about 50%. So. Right. No, that's about it. Nothing gets 100%. Nothing gets even close to 100%.
Really? The Baruch Dayan Emet people don't open?
50%. I guess as long as it's not your name, you're okay, right? It's like Rabbi Furman. I asked Rabbi Furman, he had his ninth great-grandchild, I don't know, a couple months or two ago. So I said, what are they going to name it? He said, as long as they don't name it Isaac. Anyhow, so I want to welcome everybody. We have officially outgrown them. After 9 years of trying, we have finally outgrown the boardroom, so I guess that's a positive sign. I handed out for you last week this wonderful, that Leora put together, at least made color as I got it off of the internet, this timeline of Jewish history and heritage, which also parallels what else is going on in the world at that time. And I want to reiterate that one of the let me back this out a second. But to say that Pirkei Avot, and most of you have been studying Pirkei Avot with me for years. Pirkei Avot, also called the Ethics of the Fathers or of the Ancestors, the Chapters of the Ancestors. It is the most widely studied of all the sections of the Talmud, and in particular because it's so pithy, because it has no Jewish law in it, but has lots of aphorisms, teachings about life that are easily applied. And as a result of it being studied and interpreted in so many ways, there are literally hundreds, probably thousands of published interpretations of Pirkei Avot. So that when I go to prepare for a session, in my library, I probably have 15 or so different commentaries in separate volumes, and some that are compendiums of Pirkei Avot. And there are many different ways to study. But I had a rather informed conversation with my friend Stephen sitting over here on Friday, and it occurred to me that I ought to explain the nature of the way that I have been trained in studying Jewish text, regardless of whether we're talking about the Torah, Bible, Talmud, rabbinic literature. The methodology of conservative Judaism, and what makes me so proud to be a conservative Jew and would be known other, is that we as conservative Jews study sacred text with the same intellectual rigor that we study any other subject. In other words, if you were studying Shakespeare, you could study Shakespeare to understand just the simple meaning of the text. You could study at a deeper level and try to understand the literary allusions that he's making to other contemporaneous texts at his time. You could take it one step further and say, what was the historical milieu that gave rise to this genre of literature? You could then say, what's the impact that that literature had in subsequent generations? There, you're only talking, not only, but you're talking about a certain kind of literature and a certain kind of genius, but you're talking about literature that was designed as entertainment. But it's interesting to understand all of these other facets, because if you really want to have a deep understanding of Shakespeare, you want to know it from all of these different angles. When we're talking about the fundamental founding principles and the evolution of our faith, of what it means to be the spiritual beings we are and to inherit the spiritual traditions that come before us, that seems not only relevant, but essential. Because if the goal of Jewish life is to have sacred, traditional text inform your modern life, to shape your world outlook and affect the way that you live in the world, it behooves us to understand how that process has evolved over time and done the same thing for countless generations of Jews. Okay? And so that's why I started with this timeline of Jewish history and heritage, not only to understand exactly where it fits, but to understand the methodology that we're bringing to this sacred literature. So I wanted to kind of set that up because we do spend a lot of time talking about history. And parenthetically, it is the conservative movement that really sort of was the groundbreakers when it comes to studying Judaism in this way. You would think that what I just told you is obvious, and everybody would want to study, a subject in terms of its historical development and its influence in society and all of that. It's not true. Sacred text is often simply taken as sacred text, and it's seen as something as holy, and you don't question it, you don't ask where it came from, you don't know why, you don't ask why it was written, you don't ask why did it put certain things in and leave certain things out, you don't ask questions about how it might have spoken to another audience versus how it would speak to today. Colleen is, my wife, is teaching in another hour or two. She teaches at Stockton University, and she's teaching women in the Bible. An undergraduate course. And one of the assignments that she gave to her kids, they were studying the first 2 chapters of Genesis. And one of the assignment that she gave to her kids, the undergrads that she showed me last night, so she has, she sent them 12 different images in art of the first 2 chapters of Genesis, which talk about the creation of humanity. In chapter 1, male and female created together at the same time, and in chapter 2, man created first in Adam's rib being taken, cauterized, and miraculously made into a woman. 2 different versions of the same story, Genesis 1 and 2. And so she sent them images of these from both classical art and modern art. And some of the modern art has Adam and Eve as having dark skin, because if they came from the area where we think they were African. And a lot of the people in her class are minorities. They're Hispanic and a few African Americans and some Caucasians as well. And what does it mean that the depiction of biblical heroes have your color skin? It might not mean anything to us because we're white, right? But I happened to be watching with Helene very highbrow television when I should have been doing something else, The Bachelor. So this week, all right, how many of you are willing to admit you watched The Bachelor this week? All right, so let me tell you what you missed. So there's this, so the whole premise of the show is preposterous. And far more scripted than any of us, than the watchers, realize. But he goes on one of his dates with these 20 different women, and this woman is an African American I forget what business she's in. I didn't watch the whole show, but I watched this particular section of it. And she's an African American, beautiful, articulate graduate of Yale. And so they show them talking to each other, and then they show vignettes to soliloquies, little monologues where she's talking directly to the camera, obviously being interviewed by someone. And so she said, she said, you don't understand what this would, what this means to me to be on the show, because, to marry Ari would be like my dream come true, but women who look like me don't get those fairy tale endings. You don't see black women, happening to them in this way, It's true, right? And it's the same thing, and so it's interesting to me to understand, and to me that's a perfect parallel to the biblical imagery that Helene was talking about with showing her students of Adam and Eve and that sort of thing. And so to me, the way that something is presented in the milieu when it comes into history, it gives us such a more depth and feeling of what this really means and the place that it has in history, and to be able to understand it on those different levels doesn't make it less holy to me. It makes it more important and more holy because I see it in a much larger picture, and it touches more aspects of my intellectual, emotional, and spiritual life. And so that's why we study kind of the way that we do. And part of this conversation, the genesis of this conversation, is why we study, why I spend so much time talking about the history of the text. But also how we can understand how some of the aspects of certain realms of Jewish thought seem to contradict others, because some people are very interested in the history and the background, and some people are simply interested in what is God telling us to do. And sometimes those are in conflict. And also, because we're talking about history, historical interpretation varies depending on who's writing that history, and that's why also the interpretations can be diametrically opposed to one another based on the same text. So I wanted to put that out there. And if you're looking at your chart, just in terms of the history, and before we get to our particular Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva in particular, the time period that we're talking about is if you look in the middle, where it's number 1, year number 1, we're talking about just to the right of that, where it says the Tanaim, that period right in there, it's where the Roman Empire, that's when Pirkei Avot was written. Somewhere in the period between the Zugot and the Tanaim. The Zugot are called the pairs, and the pairs, the most famous of all of the pairs is, anybody? Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were the two. They lived sometime before the year 1. And they, as we spoke about last week, they had students of their own, and those students became schools. So there was the school of Hillel, Beit Hillel, and Beit Shammai. And through their discourse back and forth, they began really to democratize Jewish learning by teaching other sages and rabbis who in turn led their communities and spread Judaism to more people. Not to a tremendous amount of people, because it took an explosion in Jewish history to really create a diaspora of Jewish learning. Hillel and which I'm going to get to in a second. Hillel and Shammai are the first what we call the Pharisees. And the reason we know about the Pharisees is because the New Testament writes about them. We have some evidence of them in Jewish history and Roman history, particularly Josephus, who was a Roman general who wrote about the destruction of the first temple. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's very important to understand this element of Jewish history. The Pharisees, this is Jerusalem is in this time of the Zugot, is a colossally successful, bustling European city of 2,000 years ago. Huge construction projects going on, including Herod redoing the entire temple, brings in thousands and thousands of workers from all over the world who bring in their own cultures as well, and are being paid. They're not slave labor, they're being paid. They have money with the money that they have, they spend and build a retail, trade in Jerusalem. This is a well-moneyed, cosmopolitan for its time, big city that is alive and vibrant, and the center of it in the Jewish world is the temple. The temple is run by descendants of Aaron, the very first high priest, and they are called the Sadducees, in contradiction to the Pharisees, and they run the temple, and they basically control power at that time, until, and at the same time, with that power sort of being centralized only in Jerusalem and only in the temple, it's not great for Judaism because your expression of Jewish identity came from offering sacrifices to these guys, who then shared that food with their family, kind of got rich on it, and it became a pretty corrupt system pretty early on. So you can see the Pharisees, it wasn't just that they wanted to democratize the study of Torah. They also were kind of rebelling against what they saw as a corrupt system, where the Sadducees, and by the way, another famous Pharisee rebelled against that too, most famously for turning over the tables of the money changers in Jerusalem. That's that same historical context. That Jesus was a Pharisee is not lost, should not be lost on any of us. That whole idea, he took Torah to the masses in a different direction, but came from the exact same impetus, which was that the idea that people should have access to holiness without having to go through a conduit, namely the sacrificial system. Oddly enough, Paul turned that around and made Jesus. You had to go through him to get there, ironically. But that wasn't the way that it initially started out. But the Sadducees believed that the only Torah that there was what is actually written in the book. Chapter and verse in the book without oral interpretation. What the Pharisees said was, no, there's a whole lot of oral interpretation that tells us how to put this book into action. It's sort of the difference between the Constitution and case law. They believe the case law continued to develop over time, and that it was incumbent upon Jews to learn what's in this book, learn how to apply it, and from that make an oral tradition that will allow the tradition to be able to really take hold and address every aspect of Jewish people's lives. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, which was a cataclysmic event that ultimately worked out to be great for the Jews if we think that the last 2,000 years of Jewish history have been productive. Now, as was pointed out to me, we still pray in some sources for the rebuilding of the temple. We don't really mean that. We don't really want the temple. I mean, we do say it. I mean, some people do, and some people honestly in their liturgy do. But you can understand why the rabbinic tradition, once the Sadducees' power base was eliminated, the Pharisees then gained tremendous impact in the world because their Jewish tradition, their teaching, wasn't based on that one little place. It was now able to go out and start synagogues and congregations and bring Jewish learning to as many people as possible. And if the goal is to take as much of God's word and sacred tradition to as many people as possible, the destruction of the temple ironically worked out to be good for the Jews. And so,
what's the difference between the Sadducees and the Sadducees?
Same thing. I don't know. Maybe I got something in my throat. Did I say both?
No,
Well, I think I'm hearing with a G, but it's the D, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Sadducees.
So in Hebrew, that's dukim.
It's Dukim in Hebrew. Yeah, Sadducees. Yeah.
Oh, Sadducees.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said the goal. That's an important term.
Right.
So when you said that, do you mean the goal is to spread Judaism to as many Jews and the world as possible, or is the goal bigger than that?
Well, that goal is the means to the end. The ultimate goal is to be able to be aligned with your Creator and serve your Creator in a way that makes the world a better place. I think if this is just written as history, we're certainly missing the whole point of the book. It's to be able to transform lives. But yeah, ultimately, I think that the goal of Jewish life is that if we've got, and maybe it's just my personality, I'm the kind of person, like, you know, if I have something that I like, I just want to share it with everybody.
Yeah.
So maybe I kind of project it that way. Like if I'm like, oh, you got to taste this, you know? Or I just found the most wonderful thing on the internet. Or look at this wonderful picture that everybody's got to have a copy of. So maybe that's just me about Judaism, but that's the way that I read Jewish life. That the goal of Jewish life really is to take this precious, life-transforming way of life and to bring it to as many people where they're at, to lift them up in the same way that I was privileged to experience.
Yeah, I'm here to learn. You know, I'm totally open-minded, but I've heard in other contexts that the goal is for the temple to be rebuilt,
Right.
the Mashiach to come,
Right.
and for us, for this reality to be a different reality.
Right, and I totally understand that line of reasoning, but it's not. It doesn't resonate with me at all. So not at all. I appreciate it as one interpretation of Jewish history, but the whole idea of our being able to bring the Messiah has historically not worked out great for the Jews. In particular, it's a great segue, by the way, to who we're going to be studying, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva made the mistake, and we're going to talk about this in just a few minutes, Rabbi Akiva made the mistake of thinking that one of his generals, Bar Kokhba, was the Messiah, followed him, and as a result, the whole thing was for fallen and died of torture, Rabbi Akiva. And, you know, Shabbatai Tzvi and all kinds of messianic heroes. I understand why, particularly Lubavitch, and all. It is a powerful, motivating idea. And I think, by the way, that's why, one second, that's why I think when I go and meet with people, I don't do this a lot anymore, people tend to come to us, but when I was starting to rebuild the shul 20 years ago, I used to go into people's homes and I would say, you know, bring a group of friends together and let me talk to them about synagogue. And then I would say, here's what I do, and here's what I think, and this is the kind of synagogue we're putting together here. If this resonates with you, come to us. But if it doesn't, find another synagogue whose message does resonate with you. Because you should be, Jews need community and they need synagogue. They might not like the tune that's coming out of Krupnik's horn. So let them find somebody else who's playing a different tune. But go listen to the music. So that's kind of it.
Yeah, those ideas, though, are in Maimonides' Yipta.
Yeah, okay.
Of the rebuilding of the temple.
Yeah, it's not to say, and that's why Stephen precisely said it, because Chabad isn't making this stuff up. They're citing a particular aspect of rabbinic literature. One of the biggest problems with messianic movements, period, is it takes the onus of responsibility off the individual. At least it can. In other words, yes, we're the ones who are supposed to bring about Mashiach through our own, but ultimately, the salvation will come from another source. Whereas I kind of think this world is what we got. And we got to make the most of it, and we got to try our best to transform it. Anyhow, so the Zugota are these pairs that come up here, and then and the most famous of them is Hillel and Shammai, and the most famous of Hillel's students is a man named Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai lives during the destruction of the Second Temple. So the Romans lay siege to it around 68. They destroy it in 70. And we talked about this in previous sessions, but for those of you who haven't been with us before, it's very, very important because this book is a byproduct of that historical experience. Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the leaders in the besieged city of Jerusalem, walled city, Romans outside, Jews inside, trying to starve them out, trying to figure out the predominant opinion of what should be done is that you should, inside the city, is we should fight to the last, and if we die as martyrs, we will have died in the name of God. Yochanan ben Zakkai says, not me. Yochanan ben Zakkai was a pacifist. Yochanan ben Zakkai said, God gave us a Torah to live by, not to die by. And so what he does, according to rabbinic literature, now of course the rabbinic literature is written by Yochanan ben Zakkai's descendants, but as it's written in the Talmud, which is sort of the historical source, during this period of time from 200 to 500 of the common era. It says that Vespasian was the general in charge of overseeing Jerusalem. You know this story? Anybody nod your head if you know? Okay? No? So, this is a great story because this really it will totally help you to understand where we came from as Jews. Vespasian is the general. Yochanan ben Zakkai hears all these people saying we want to die as martyrs. He's trying to convince a smaller group of people, no, let's give in to the Romans so that we can continue to live and thrive in some other way, but at least we'll be alive and we'll be able to perpetuate this tradition. If we die, it dies with us. Which is, by the way, parenthetically, why swearing-in ceremonies for the Israeli military no longer take place at Masada. They used to take place at Masada until people said, wait a minute, they all died. Now they take place at Dakota.
Yeah.
When I first started going to Israel, they used to take place at Masada. Yochanan ben Zakkai says, let me get to talk to Vespasian. So he has some of his students, and remember, he's Hillel's youngest but smartest disciple. Put him in a coffin, because you can't bury your dead within the city walls because of ritual impurity from the Torah itself. Smuggles him out, gets to meet with Vespasian, says to Vespasian, I had a dream, and in my dream, you become the emperor. And Vespasian says, tell me more. And he says, when you become the emperor, and you will become the emperor, all I ask is that you allow me and my disciples to have this little town called Yavne, which today is near the city of Rehovot in modern-day Israel. And Vespasian becomes the emperor, keeps his promise, Jerusalem is destroyed, but Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students found the first center of rabbinic learning in Yavne, which is why that word Yavne is still so important in Jewish tradition to this day, and found what essentially becomes the first yeshiva, the first center of Jewish learning. And Yochanan ben Zakkai, of course, as the student of Hillel, was raised in that Pharisaic tradition. They become the first rabbis. Hillel's not Rabbi Hillel, he's just Hillel. But after the destruction of the temple, the power shifts entirely away from the Sadducees, bye-bye, no more, to the Pharisees, who now have this wonderful tradition of oral interpretations you can take everywhere. And it's like it literally becomes a diaspora. I was doing a unit with the sixth graders and their parents. And sixth graders didn't know the word diaspora, which I didn't expect them to. But you know what a diaspora is, literally. And I don't know if they have them everywhere in the country. Harvey, you can tell me about California, but here, the bane of any lawn keeper's existence is dandelions. And the reason is because when you take that that puffball and you blow on it, and all the seeds go in, that spreading of the seeds is literally a diaspora, a spreading of seeds. And that's what the word diaspora means. It means literally the spreading of the seeds. And so you're blowing on it, which carries those seeds all over the place, look at the cataclysm that was the destruction of the temple as the beginning of that puffball, of that diaspora, which starts with one guy, Yochanan ben Zakkai. One of Yochanan ben Zakkai's greatest students was Rabbi Akiva. So that's sort of the historical chain that takes it. So we are all of us descended from the Pharisees, because you might have been from the with two exceptions: if you're a Kohen or a Levi. If you're a Kohen or a Levi, because if you're a Kohen, you are descended from the Sadducees, because they have their line directly back to Aaron, through the high priest in the temple, through genetically up to you. There is actually a thing called the Kohen gene. It's not 100% reliable, but apparently it's still something that many Kohanim still carry. So you should see if you have the Noah Cohen gene.
It's on the male chromosome, though.
Oh, it's on the thank you, doctor. Great. So anyhow, I don't know about the Kohen gene, but I know that the tradition is that Kohanim go all the way back to Aaron, and therefore go through the Sadducees. The rest of us all become the descendants of Rabbinic Judaism, through the Pharisees. And what makes, now, of course, on one hand, for those who are praying for the restoration of the temple and therefore see that cataclysm as a disaster in Jewish history, that is what was a disaster. But for us, who see Judaism in the diaspora as being just a much broader spectrum, with being able to practice and live Judaism in lots of different areas, in lots of different ways, with lots of different leaders, and lots of different interpretation. We all see that as a good thing. That's the Judaism that we inherited. And in large measure, the thing that makes it so great is that it has access, that everyone has access to it. When it was only the Sadducees, you needed to have a certain level of understanding. Not everybody knows how to shecht a pigeon with their thumb the right way, the way the Kohanim did. But everybody was raised to read Hebrew. We still have Hebrew school. My guess is there wasn't Hebrew school before before there was Pharisees, so that everyone has access to learning and interpreting. I help you to do it, but you can do it yourself. This book is in front of you as much as it's in front of me, and interpretation as much more so. What Rabbi Akiva does that makes the entire process wide open is he begins the process of exegesis. Exegesis is taking the sacred text and giving a myriad of interpretations based on it that are not necessarily contained in the text itself. In other words, to bring an intellectual rigor to the text to say, here are various ways of interpreting it. Those interpretations, of course, I'm interested in not only because they make it into a vibrant faith and bring God's word to as many people as possible and build community, but it also enables lots of other people to be able to study. One of Rabbi Akiva's study partners was a guy named Rabbi Ishmael. And if you open up your Siddur to page 13, page 12, sorry, page 12, open up your page 12. Rabbi Ishmael, and again, we're talking about right during that period of the Tanaim. If you're looking on he's a Tana, Rabbi Ishmael. And you see what it says? Rabbi Ishmael says the Torah may be expounded by these 13 rules of textual interpretation. An inference may be drawn from one premise to another that is more inclusive or to be less inclusive. An inference may be drawn from similar phrases in two texts. A comprehensive principle may be derived from a single text or related from two. In other words, these are all rules on how to interpret the Torah. And we say this to this day. All Jews who daven say this every single day and have for 2,000 years. The exegetical method has been codified in the Siddur. We say this every single morning. You got to come pretty early for it.
Before Kaddish.
You got to come, pretty early. But ask Len. He's here every Shabbos morning at 9 o'clock. By 10 after 9, we're skimming through this. It's not easy. Word is, from Tuesday mornings, you don't cull a lot from reading this, but it's what it stands for that's so important, which is, here we're saying in the very beginning, here are the tools to interpret Torah. This is, you use these methodologies, and you too can interpret Torah. This is the way we got a tradition to be Rabbinic Judaism today, from the school of Rabbi Ishmael. And the difference between, by the way, parenthetically, between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael is that Rabbi Ishmael is much more logic-based, and Rabbi Akiva's was like every little crown of the Torah has meaning, the shape of the letters and all of that. And Rabbi Akiva says it's very nice, but there's nothing logical and scientific about it. We went with the scientific, more structural approach. But that methodology is here to this day. Now, questions? Comments? Because now we're going to open up the text, and we had just begun on page 45, Mishnah number 14 in the 3rd chapter.
Rabbi, you have more books?
Can
I do. I have a lot more books. Does anybody else need one? Mine's right behind you, and then we'll pass the other one down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
What page?
45. Page 45. And the he who it's talking about here is Rabbi Akiva. How do I know? Because he was the one that was referenced in the previous Mishnah. Okay? Rabbi Akiva, who died in year 135 as a result of backing Bar Kokhba as the Messiah, he used to say, human beings are loved because they were made in God's image. That they were created in God's image was made known by a special love, for it is said, for God made human beings in the divine image. Okay? See what that is? That's exegesis. Human beings are loved because they're created in a divine image. The Torah says, for God made human beings in the divine image. It doesn't say, and that's why God loves them. That's exegesis. That's him taking the text and saying, here's what we learn from it. Okay? Israel is loved, for they are called the children of God. That they were called the children of God was made known to them by a special love, as it is said, you are the children of Adonai, your God. He quotes Deuteronomy. You see what he's doing? He's taking something that you want to learn, that he wants you to learn, but he's linking it to the sacred text. Why? Because this is how the oral tradition begins to take root. He wants people to remember the Torah, but he wants them to see it as applicable to their everyday life, and so he embeds the sacred text in these ethical teachings. That they were called the children of God was made known to them by a special love, as it says, you are children of Adonai your God. Israel is even more loved because to them was given a precious instrument. That such a precious instrument was given to them was made known to them by a special love. For it is said, for I have given you a good doctrine. Do not forsake my Torah, ki lekachtot natati lachem, torati al tazova, which we know from the Torah service, the end of the Torah service, on Shabbos and weekdays from Eitz Chaimi. That's the last line of Eitz Chaimi. Anyway, what's Rabbi Akiva doing here? Several things. First of all, what he needs to do is he needs to be able to reestablish Jewish learning as the basis for connecting with God. The temple's been destroyed. The conduit between us and God of sacrifice is no longer available. How do you relate to God? Through study of the sacred word. How do you study the sacred word? By applying it in a way that speaks to Amcha, to people in general. But interestingly, when you tell people, I got this great sacred tradition for you, it's going to give your life meaning and purpose and definition. You go, oh, yeah, bring it on. And then you say, lay it on me. You say, well, you can't do this, and you can't do that. And on Saturday, you can't do this, and this. And, you can eat, some stuff, but sometimes, some stuff, sometimes, and I'm not even talking about Passover, we'll put that one on the side for now, you go they go, and the gift of that is, right? Well, so for instance, what Rabbi Akiva said before in mission number on the previous page, Rabbi Akiva often said, laughter or frivolity lead to lewdness. Tradition is a fence around the Torah, so keeps you from making mistakes. Tithes are a fence around wealth. Give away some more of your money and you'll appreciate it more. Vows are a fence around absence, and silence is a fence around wisdom. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun, right? So what Rabbi Akiva, but see, that's part of the context of this particular Mishnah. Now he's saying God gave us all that stuff because he loves us, right? It's kind of like saying, I'm putting you in timeout because I love you, right? And but ultimately, when children become parents, they realize that that's true. When they're children, they don't appreciate that at all. I love you so much. If I didn't love you, I'd let you do whatever you want, right? We know that that's true, but no kid ever wants to hear that. What Rabbi Akiva is essentially saying is, what's he talking about in the previous mission? Self-restraint. the discipline and self-restraint and not behaving like an animal and doing whatever you want whenever you want is what refines us as individuals and makes us closer to God. So the next Mishnah kind of explains and says, I'm really giving you a gift by that. This is something that I'm doing for your interest, says God to the Jewish people. It might not seem like it now, but Rabbi Akiva is trying to introduce, by the way, at the same time when someone else who was trying to introduce another idea, which was exactly the opposite, which was you can have all of this without any of the restrictions, without being able to eat whatever you want, without having to do with a holiday. Different interpretation, but coming from the same impetus of trying to make this into a living faith. He's saying all of these things were actually given as a gift. Human beings are loved because they were created in the image of God. That we were created in God's image was made to us by an even more special love. God loves everybody like all parents love their children. But good parents are going to give their children limits. They're going to give them guidance. They're going to give them parameters so that they will be more on the straight and narrow. For God made human beings in the divine image. Israel are therefore called the children of God. That's why we're called the children of God, the sons and daughters of God, because a heavenly parent looks out for us, but also gives limitations on the things that we can and cannot do, because that's good parenting. Hands-on parenting is good parenting. And that we were called children of God was made known to them by a special love. You are the children of Adonai your God. Israel is even more loved because to them was given the precious instrument, namely the Torah. That such a precious instrument was given to them, was made known to them by a special love. For it says, for I have given you a good doctrine. Do not forsake my Torah. Rambam Maimonides in this says, he who bestows a favor on another and informs him of the benefit conferred discloses greater love than one who does favor but does not inform him. Which I'll give you my own interpretation. When I meet with bar bat mitzvah families, as I have with many of you around the table, with you and your kids, so I interview the kid, and at the end of that hour and a half meeting, we talk about aliyahs. But in between, there's a part of the service, part of the meeting, where I turn to the parent and I say, tell me what you love about your daughter. Tell me what you love about your son. And the most inattentive child is hanging on their parents' every word at that moment. Why? Because even if you think they know it, you reminding of them of what makes them unique, special, loved in the eyes of a third person means the world to them. Because until you articulate the beauty of the relationship that only you share, even if it's understood, it's only understood. Once you take it to that next level and you're able to articulate it and say, you know, and by the way, I warned parents ahead of time. I just did this past Sunday for the whole group of parents. I'm telling them, I'm going to ask you this question. So practice now. Think about it, because because I don't want to turn to you and say, what do you love about your son? And you say, never really thought about it, you know, or at best, you know, he never gives us a lick of trouble. You know, he's kind of the kind of kid you just can leave him on his own and everything will be fine. You know, versus the things that make you unique in my eyes because I've spent my life watching you grow, and you're this unique, precious individual who has these idiosyncrasies and these talents and this way of looking at the world that I just think is so cool. Mm-hmm. Well, a kid who hears that feels better about themselves than the person who doesn't. And that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying here. That God he's articulating this to a generation who a generation before had seen the temple destroyed, and saying God has this special relationship with you. But the special relationship is because you were created in God's image. So I'm reminding you of that. And not only were you created in God's image, but you're like a child. God looks after you the way that a parent looks after a child. And that's why he gave you this Torah. And that's why this is worth maintaining. Because God appreciates the Jewish people in this unique kind of way. And we have that special relationship. But from the result of that relationship, also comes obligation. Our obligation as parents is to tell our kids what to do, particularly when they're going to make mistakes. But our children's obligation to us is to appreciate that we're doing this in their best interest, that we're making sacrifices on their behalf so that they can get ahead in life. And that relationship, and that's why the word that is repeated here most often, as we talked about last week, is love. Love is relationship. To give you, and relationship is proven not by emotion, but by action. That's why the mitzvot, and I see you. I'll give you an example from my own life this morning. So Helene loves coffee. So it's like, as anybody who knows her knows, she's probably coming out in utero. She had a little teeny Starbucks in her hand. So she loves. My wife loves coffee, and particularly, of course, first thing in the morning. So it is one of my great joys to, when her alarm goes off, go and make coffee and bring it to her bedside. I've always done that for many, many years.
Wow.
Yeah, I love doing it. I'm not always home to do it, but I happened to be home this morning, and I heard the alarm go off, and I made the coffee, and I do it.
Very nice.
Fairly frequently.
I gotta tell Jack.
And I don't point it out to pat myself on the back too much, so you can. So then, as Helene and I were both studying this morning, with our books open in front of us across the kitchen table. So I said to her today, did I tell you how much I love you today? And she said, no, but you showed me.
That's nice.
That's exactly what this is talking about. The demonstration, and therefore the actions lead to love implies relationship. That relationship implies action. You can say you love a person. When I counsel people who are in abusive relationships, but she says she loves me, but he says he loves me, but he hits me, or she's verbally abusive to me. You can say you love as much as you want, but if it's not demonstrable, to my mind, it's not real love. Love is what is shown through the way that we behave, the way we interrelate to each other. And that's why God gives us the Torah, because it's not enough to have an emotional relationship with God. We need to show that we're willing to do the things that show that this is a loving, dynamic relationship that's based on give and take. That's what Rabbi Akiva is trying to teach here. And if you think about it, if this is the second generation of Rabbinic Judaism, that's what starts this. That's why when people say, I don't need a synagogue, I don't need organized religion, I'm already a good person, I don't really believe in prayer, I don't believe in a supernatural God, what do I need all of this for? Because what we learn here in the way that we practice shows our commitment to these higher values. Random thoughts. When you come to make a minyan, just because you want to come to make a minyan so somebody else could say Kaddish, that's the way you're showing your dedication to your faith. You could walk around and say, my faith is very important. But when you're building community by showing up, that's a different level of relationship. I'm just looking at you guys, maybe think of that. But that's what Rabbi Akiva is. Love implies relationship, and relationship implies action due to responsibility. That sense of responsibility. Yeah.
Just a quick question. What happens about if you don't follow everything, like Shabbat, keeping kosher?
To me it would be like Helene saying to me, okay, you brought the coffee, where are my slippers? Right, one of my most formative teachers always reminded me as a kid, a little bit of something is better than a whole lot of nothing. Yeah. And so any, to my mind, there is no measure of, I don't use the word good Jew. Those two words, it's a non sequitur. Jews are Jews, and sometimes they do good things, and sometimes they do bad things. And there's no barometer of what makes a quote-unquote good Jew based on religious observance. I wish there was. I honestly wish there was. I wish that there was a one-to-one correspondence between how frum you are and what a mensch you are. But everybody around this table knows that's not true, right?
Right.
I wish that it was true, but it's not true. But what is true is that the teachings that we learn from our sacred tradition help us to think about our lives in a more meaningful and deep way than we would have come up on our own. A child can raise themselves. It happens. And turn out to be wonderful people. But the odds are they're going to be better if somebody takes an active interest in their development. And that's the same thing that we believe about Torah and Jewish life. You could probably figure some of this stuff out. You could probably figure a lot of this stuff out. But it's better to have an instructor. It's better to have guides. It's better to have some parameters. It's better to have goals, to have ideals, to have values. And in that sense, by the way, Stephen, I think that messianic idea is right. That if every time we step back from doing the right thing, we're causing civilization not to move forward, whether or not, that's a bad thing. So I would buy in to that aspect of it. We're going to take a little bit, we're going to just, at the next session, we'll just look a little bit at the sources that he brings here, because they also say something about Rabbi Akiva's worldview. But the hour is up, and I hope everybody enjoyed studying, and we'll meet again next week. Now, if you want to turn us off, the red button in the middle. Ladies, will you make sure I'm recording?
Right, red dot, you're on.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last day of January and the last day of our class for about 3 weeks. And we're going to be picking up in part where we left off. I wanted to mention, we had spoken a little bit last time about the methodology that I use as a conservative Jew and conservative chained rabbi, and historian such as it is. The methodology that we use is to apply to the study of Judaism the same intellectual rigor and scientific methodology we would to any other subject. So to know the history and the background and the milieu, the contemporaneous society, all that's very important, understanding where the text comes from and the audience that it was first written for. So that approach to Jewish life owes its loyalty and origin to conservative Judaism. The idea of studying Judaism as a science, as the history of a people, in the same way that we would study American history or any aspect of European history, is uniquely conservative Judaism. The movements, of course, arose at the end of the 19th century, end of the 19th century. The first movement in Judaism was Reform. Prior to that, there was no such thing as Orthodoxy. There was just Judaism. Just Jews were Jews. Reformed Jews in Germany in the 1850s, 1860s began to want to integrate further and created a non-halachic, non-law-based system of religious practice. The sort of knee-jerk swinging the pendulum far the opposite way was Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism arose as a response to Reform Judaism, not the other way around. So first it was just Jews. Then German Jews began Reform Judaism as a way of integrating into the world around them. If not being able to eat what everybody else was eating was keeping you from doing business, in the best clubs and restaurants, then kashrut is not something that isn't necessarily incumbent. If the way you're dressing and Shabbos and all of those kinds of things that separate Jews are keeping us from integrating into European society, they propose, why not have Shabbos on Sundays, and why not do away with the laws of kashrut and all of these other, and so that was in the 1850s. By the 1860s, 1870s already, you start to have a movement that says no, Judaism has to be fixed and solidified, and so the father of that was a guy named Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in Germany. Anyhow, he and a bunch of others at that time created Orthodox Judaism. It's an orthopraxy that Jews should based on the Jewish code called the Shulchan Aruch, written in the 16th century, have a uniform code of practice. And they dug in as a response to Reform Judaism and created Orthodoxy. And in between the two of them, around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, came conservative Judaism, which was somewhere in between, a uniquely American movement. It was about integration and at the same time maintaining tradition, conserving Judaism, as we were talking about, tradition and change. And one of the ways that this new brand of Judaism sort of defined itself was this historical approach to Judaism. So Solomon Schechter, who everybody knows the name because it's Solomon Schechter Schools, was the first chancellor of the seminary. He was a rabbi, but he was a teacher at Cambridge in England. He was not, a yeshiva professor. He was a scholar of ancient Semitic text. And so in founding the seminary, what they tried to do was to be able to create an institution that was in every way as intellectually rigorous about the study of Judaism as Harvard was the study of sociology. And put together a top-notch faculty that was based not on the great yeshivas of Europe, but the great secular academies of learning at that time. We drew from some of the greatest scholars in Europe and put together an all-star team that became the Jewish Theological Seminary. And one of the things that they did is that they not only started a school for rabbis, like me, where the seminary was interested in training you both in text and in practical rabbinics, how to organize and run a community. But they were also interested in this historical approach to Judaism as an evolving civilization. And so, in founding the seminary, they also founded the Jewish Museum. How many have ever been to the Jewish Museum? I was just there. I happened to be there on Shabbos, this past Shabbos. So the Jewish Museum is in the Warburg Mansion, which was given by Mrs. Warburg in the 40s to from Pinchas Warburg and very well-to-do banking family. In the 40s, after he died, the widow Warburg gave the mansion, gorgeous mansion on 92nd and 5th Avenue. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 92nd and 5th Avenue. Unbelievable. I mean, worthy of the Andrew Carnegie's and those mansions. It's up there. Right. So the Cooper Hewitt Museum, which is like at 81st, 82nd, is Andrew Carnegie's mansion. The Warburg Mansion's in 92nd. They gave it. Anyhow, Warburg was a collector of Judaic and Jewish art, and he gave his wife gave his collection and the mansion over to the Jewish Theological Seminary to start a museum of Judaism, of Jewish history, of Jewish life. And for the first time, really, any museum anywhere took Jewish ceremonial art and looked at it as art. Not simply for the ceremonial side, but for the intrinsic beauty of the art and the history of where it came from. And the reason that I emphasize it is not only because we were talking about it last time, but I happened to be there this past Shabbos. And if you haven't been there in a while and can get there soon, there is a fantastic exhibit on the first floor of clothing, of Jewish clothing from around the world, most of it from the last 100 years. It's on loan from the Israel Museum, and it is fascinating because what it shows is the way that Jewish traditional clothing very much mirrored the societies around them. So, for instance, there's clothes from, but it's not of course. If I were to tell you that many Jews, many Jewish women wore burqas, you would say that's not Judaism. Yeah, they did. If they were living in Afghanistan, they had their own kind of Jewish face coverings that were uniquely Jewish. They didn't dress like the Muslims. They didn't dress like the Christians, but they went with their faces covered with veils, just like in Afghanistan today.
They're still doing
I don't think there's too many Jews left in Afghanistan, but the costuming is so much a reflection of Jews mixing with the world around them. So, for instance, the chief Sephardic rabbi's kaftan is there, and it is a mixture of Ottoman styling, the robe with the they have all the embroidery around, the chest. But it also has stripes on it that were taken from the British military uniforms. They incorporated the British military uniforms. They took Christian, Muslim, and Jewish clothing styles and integrated them into something uniquely Jewish. That whole idea, it seemed to me that was so emblematic of what we're talking about here. Judaism never evolved in a vacuum, including now. And the conservative Judaism, which takes into account the historical evolutionary approach to Jewish life as it mixes and integrates and picks and chooses what parts of the secular world, the world around it, to incorporate into Judaism, that's authentic Judaism. A Judaism that continues to evolve, that recognizes the changing demographics and political landscape, and evolves to continue to take God's word and sacred teachings and make them relevant in every single generation. That's authentic Judaism. Historically, that's authentic Judaism. And the Jewish Museum is just so emblematic of that if you have a chance to get up there. And we went on Shabbos. On Shabbos, the Jewish Museum is totally free. And there was a line around the block to get in because they have a metal detector and you couldn't walk in quickly. But still, because the museum is free, all these people I knew, and one thing that I've learned working here, particularly over the past 15 years, is you can't tell who's Jewish just by looking at them. At any given Shabbos at Bethel, you cannot tell who the Jews are and who are not. You just assume everybody's Jewish, because what a Jew looks like today is not, there's not one typical Jewish stereotypes. I don't want to guess who was in the line there, but there were a lot of different people who looked like they were from a lot of different ethnic backgrounds, and a lot of them didn't look like they were Jewish, but a lot of them were there to appreciate Judaism as a culture. As a culture with a history and its own, not only iconography, but its own artistic styles and its own way of integrating tradition and change. So if you get a chance to get up there, that is very much worth looking at. Okay.
Rabbi, where did the black pants and white shirts come from?
Eastern Europe, clearly, but the other thing also, by the way, if you go to this, is that Jews dressed traditionally, particularly for festive occasions, with so much color, so much bright and vivid color. There's nothing black and white there, including the Hasidic Rebbe's kaftans, which are in the color of blue. Is like the color of your glasses. Yeah, black with these beautiful, vivid blue and silver stripes. I mean, it's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. It would look beautiful. I mean, it was like a long black dress, but all of it, there was so little of it that was just simply black and white. It was an explosion of color and very, very traditional at the same time, in terms of Jewish choices. Okay, we are studying now on pages 44 and 45. We are looking at the history of the writing of Rabbi Akiva, and I wanted to just take a couple of minutes before we get in. I have so much cool stuff to share with you today. I wanted to share with you a little bit about Rabbi Akiva because so many people have heard his name before. And by the way, in Hebrew it's Akiva with a vet. In Philadelphia, for anybody any kids went to that day school and it was so called, it's Akiva. But it is in the original, it is Akiva. Anyhow, so Rabbi Akiva, you'll remember from last time, Rabbi Akiva is really the second generation of rabbis. There's Hillel, if you wanted to look at your sheets, your history sheets, their names appear on here right in the middle. You'll see that I'm in the Jewish historical figures, the second column up from the bottom, down here, this area right here. If you look, just in terms, history is very important, obviously, to me and us. So if you look at Hillel and Shammai, they come before the year 1 and a little bit over into it. Yochanan ben Zakkai is the guy I was talking about, the rabbi last time, who was smuggled out in a coffin because he was a pacifist, and he convinced Vespasian to let him out, and he made peace. Yochanan ben Zakkai is after the destruction of the temple. Hillel and Shammai are before the destruction of the temple, and then the next generation doesn't appear on here, but Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Eliezer, and their student was Rabbi Akiva. So Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Akiva, as you can see, lived around the same time, although Rabbi Akiva was born later and died later than Yochanan ben Zakkai. So we're talking about Rabbi Akiva, who lived from 60 of the Common Era about to 135 the Common Era. And there's a couple of very interesting things about Rabbi Akiva, and just in terms of his personal background that are fascinating to me. Because remember, when we're talking about this, we're talking about the first generation of rabbinic Judaism. Everything biblical is gone. The temple is gone. The conduit, that physical conduit of sacrifice is gone. What you have now left is prayer and learning and Jewish practice in the home and the congregations. That's what Judaism is like, and they're inventing it kind of on the spot. Just in the first 100 years of modern, it's hard to call something 2,000 years old modern, but a more modern expression of Judaism at the time. And Rabbi Akiva becomes the paradigm of this. He's a very, very interesting person. So first of all, Rabbi Akiva is descended from converts. He does not have yichus. There was not, you know the word yichus? Yichus is connections. It's a good word. Yichus is like if you go into a place and you have, right. If your father was, a good customer, and you go into the store and you get treated good, you got yichus. right. If you inherit, if your father was the chief rabbi and you become the chief rabbi, you got yichus. Exactly. He had no yichus. His family was descended from non-Jews who converted to Judaism, which, by the way, should be unless you have any doubt in your mind, because there is still this lingering antipathy to converts, which is anathema to Jewish law and Jewish life. Even as I'm going through this whole process, in the groups that came out, people were lumping together non-Jews and converts to Judaism. A convert to Judaism is as Jewish as I am.
Absolutely.
And a non-Jew is as not Jewish.
Right.
There's not, according to Jewish law, you are forbidden to say to a convert, you weren't originally Jewish. You're not allowed to say to them, my ancestors are more Jewish than yours. It's against Jewish law to say that about a person who converts to Judaism. And Rabbi Akiva himself, not only Rabbi Akiva, King David was descended from Ruth, who was a convert to Judaism. The Judaism welcomes converts. The reason why Judaism doesn't welcome converts historically is because they kind of people who infiltrated and sabotaged, because we were worried about the hostile non-Jewish world around us. It seems to me, and it is doesn't seem to me, I've translated it into practice, that we live in a world where non-Jewish people love us, by and large. Is there some anti-Semitism? Yeah. But compared to historically, no. Negligible amount. And we should be actively pursuing converts to Judaism. If we have something special, we should be sharing with other people who want to join us in the journey.
So, 2 questions. Why is there a study, an explanation why Ruth and Rabbi Akiva's ancestors chose to convert? I mean, one simple reason is if your spouse isn't a Jew, then you convert. That's obvious.
Right. Well, so that's Ruth. So Ruth, that covers Ruth, because Ruth famously says, "Your people will be my people."
Although most rabbis would look at that and say that's a really poor reason to do it.
Right. Except,
right.
Yeah, I think that traditionally, a person simply wanting to marry a Jew was kind of disparaged. I think right? I don't think that anymore. I think that some of the strongest advocates for Judaism converted.
The other question is it across the board that I've heard that you're supposed to try to dissuade 3 times?
There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
What is that about?
that part is true. You want to make sure that, and this goes back to the Talmudic times, you want to make sure that the person is sincere, so you try to discourage them. Traditionally, one has tried to discourage them. So, and when I first graduated rabbinical school, it's much easier. It's much easier to be machmir, rigid, than it is to be mekil, flexible, because then you just play by the rules, right? And no latitude. So when I was ordained as a rabbi, not coming from Yichus myself, my father worked in a hardware store, my grandfather was a bar. I don't have any rabbinic lineage. I was machmir, so if somebody would call for to convert, I didn't return their phone call. So I'd make them call again because of this, this dictum, And then I realized after a little while, that's a bad marketing strategy. If you really want them, tell them you really want them, and then you got one to offer. So instead what I do is if somebody comes to me seeking conversion, first thing that I tell them is come to shul for a while to show me you're sincere.
Yeah.
Before I invest time in you, you invest time in us. Mm-hmm. So come to shul, because so much of conversion to Judaism is in fact is acculturation as opposed to intellectual learning. And now I have 3 conversion students who are studying with me right now, and they're from various backgrounds, and they are also, quite frankly, some of them are they're all smart people, but some of them write really well, and some may not write as well. And so each one writes an essay, but you don't really, I'm not judging on the amount of material they know. I'm judging whether they come to shul on Shabbos and bring their family to shul on Shabbos. And I had a student one time, she was studying with me one-on-one for an entire year from Alabama State University. She's a historically black college in Montgomery, Alabama. Anyhow, so she came to me and wanted to convert. And African-American woman, in her 20s, she was a senior at ASU. So I said to her, come to the synagogue. So she came every single Shabbos. So then I started teaching her. And I didn't have a finish date. So she said, when am I going to be done? When am I going to convert? I said, I'll let you know. I'll let you know. And so she, came the high holidays, and she sent me a Shana Tova. I said, now you're ready. A person who gets the idea that you said the Shana Tova, is part of the community. And then she converted, and she subsequently actually made Aliyah, which was also incredibly difficult for her because there is racism, unfortunately, in Israel, and they doubted her conversion. I had to write several affidavits on her behalf. But she and subsequently her mother converted, and they both live in Israel. So Rabbi Akiva was a convert. Rabbi Akiva did not come to Judaism until middle age, until he was in his 40s. He was an illiterate shepherd until he knew very, very little about Jewish life, and really all of his career was in the second half of his life. It said it's a great story to argue. It said that Rabbi Akiva, who was a shepherd, was out and he saw out in the desert area water dropping in droplets on a stone, and he noticed that the water would drop on this stone, and eventually it hollowed out the stone, and eventually the drop of water made a hole in the solid rock. And he said, if a substance soft as water can penetrate a rock with slow, persistent motion, so too the Torah, which is hard as iron, can slowly, surely penetrate my heart. Which I think is just a fantastic image of lifelong learning, and that it begins at every time. And that was the turning point in his life, and he continued to study uninterrupted tradition for 24 years. Interestingly, though, he was already a parent, and how did he learn Hebrew? He went to Cheder with his kids, which is the equivalent today of going to junior congregation with your children. That's a good thing. That's the entree. We have made it that way. That it should be something for parents and kids to learn together. But I love the idea that Rabbi Akiva, the sainted Rabbi Akiva, learned the alphabet with his kids for the first time. He is famous for having no errors in terms of putting on errors whatsoever. And there's also a very famous passage which will help us also to understand, Stephen, we're talking about the destruction of the temple. This is from the Talmud in Makot. Makot relates that once Rabbi Akiva and a number of his colleagues passed by the former location of the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, he was the generation after the destruction. They saw a fox run out of the place of the Holy of Holies. The colleagues began crying at this pathetic sight. Rabbi Akiva, however, laughed. To his surprised colleagues, he explained, "We have both the prophecy of Uriah and Zechariah. Uriah foretold, Zion shall be plowed like a field," which is in the book of Micah. Zechariah foretold, "Again shall old men and women sit in the streets of Jerusalem, and the streets of the city shall be filled with boys and girls playing." Until the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, he said, fully and literally, "I was fearful lest the prophecy of Zechariah not be fulfilled." Now that the prophecy of Uriah has been fulfilled, the destruction of the temple, it is clear that Zechariah's prophecy of men and women sitting and rejoicing in the streets of Jerusalem will finally be fulfilled. In other words, the destruction of the temple actually will lead to the rebirth of Judaism. That's where Rabbi Akiva was coming from. And I just think it's important to understand who he was, because he was, first of all, not learned from birth, did not have yichus, was not born into financial wealth, but became a great leader of the Jewish people who was acutely aware of the world around him, because he grew up as much in a secular as in a religious world, which helps us to understand the background for the beginning of the Mishnah that we've been studying on page 45. So I want to take the Chumash, because I want to point out a few things about Rabbi Akiva's teachings here. So Rabbi Akiva used to say, I'm on page 45, and we're going to open up the Chumash in just a moment. Rabbi Akiva used to say, human beings are loved because they are made in God's image. That they were created in God's image was made known by a special law, for it says, "For God made human beings in the divine image." Genesis chapter 9, verse number 6, which you'll find on page 51 if you open up your Chumash. By the way, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What do you think that means? Anybody?
We have the same capability and characteristics that God has.
We have godly characteristics, okay? So therefore, what does it mean? I mean, how is it any different than saying you look like a friend of mine? Right? I mean, we're created in God's image. Your son was created in your image. I mean, looks a lot, Zoe looks a lot like you, Karen. What's the difference between you just look like a friend of mine and to be created in God's image? What does that mean? Everybody knows that phrase, right? What does it mean? What do you think? Impossible. What? Impossible. Right, first of all, it's impossible because God doesn't have an image, right? So it can't be literally true. So what do we mean by that? We're created in God's image.
We have a responsibility to behave in a certain godly way to one another.
Right, so that we have a responsibility, like it's almost like we're carrying, God's name.
DNA.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, you would say to your kids, you carry our family name. So you need to carry with respect. People should look at you and say, this is the way a Krupnik behaves, right?
So the word image really doesn't belong.
Right, so the word image, right, it's not, as Stephen said,
It's like heresy.
Right, it's actually even it's almost like heretical, because iconography of what God looks like is, that's not what we do. It's actually against the Ten Commandments. And yet we say that we are in the image of God. So part of it, I think, means carrying God's name with respect, which is what the commandment, don't take God's name in vain, means. Doesn't mean don't say God damn it. That's not a nice thing to say anyhow. But it literally means if your people are going to know that you're Jewish and God should be influencing your life, you're God's emissary here. Don't make God look like a jerk. Right? Don't shame the family name. If that's and secondly, I think being in God's image means, and it comes from the word shadow. Tselem comes from the word tzel, which means a shadow. To live in God's shadow means that, as Robert Sue was just saying, we should emulate God's ways. Can we ever really fully know what God's ways are? We can only project. But just like we have an image, even if your father has passed away, I still know kind of like my father wants me to live now. And even if I can't physically touch him, I know the ideals and values that I still try to perpetuate. And it's that to live in the shadow of God is like to live in the shadow of the people who shaped you. And that's what I think this means here. The reason why I had you open up the Chumash is look at Genesis 9:6, and it's on page 51. And this is after Noah comes off. This is Noah, by the way. It's not Jews. This is after Noah comes off of the ark, and it says. It says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in his image did God make man. And God is talking here to Noah. Why do you think Rabbi Akiva listed Noah as the person who was created in God's image? There are other references in the Bible to using this phrase, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Why does he start with Noah?
To show that all people are equal. We're not just emulating the ways with other Jews, we're emulating the ways with all people.
Right, it starts with a certain sense of universalism. What Rabbi Akiva is doing here is very, very clever. What he's saying is that the laws of all Jewish people, the idea of being created in God's image applies to everyone. That's why the Torah doesn't begin with Abraham. Abraham doesn't come until many, many generations after the Torah. Adam and Eve weren't Jewish. Noah's not Jewish. It's 10 generations between Adam and Eve and Noah. Another 10 generations, 20 years, 200 years more, before the very first Jew comes along, to be able to say that we are all equal in terms of God's eyes. And this right here is, whoever sheds the blood of man, the man shall his blood be shed, for in God's image did God make man. What is that? That's a law. That's a rule. It's a rule. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by his blood should also be shed. Now, interestingly, this is one of what's called the 7 commandments of Noah, the Sheva mitzvot of Noah, the 7 commandments that were given to all of humanity. And the rabbis extrapolate from this. First of all, that murder is wrong, that we should establish courts, that people shouldn't eat the blood of living animals, at the time, several other mitzvot. But Rabbi Akiva is saying here is that when we're restarting Judaism, realize that we're not doing this in isolation as some small, we got a bigger plan. We're part of something much larger. And it's from him and from these early teachings, we get this idea that Jews should be a light to the nations. That Jews should be exemplary role models for other people. And so therefore he starts by referencing, now remember, at his time, Torah was not very widely available. Synagogues were just beginning, public reading of the Torah was just really gaining prominence. So he starts by introducing verses here that will focus you. So he starts with the universal, and then he goes on. Israel is loved, for they are called the children of God. That they were called the children of God was made known to them by a special love. You are the children of Adonai, your God. See Deuteronomy 14:1, which you'll see on page 1072. This is also the choice of the verses is fascinating. That God has a special relationship with the Jewish people. You could have talked about any aspect of redeeming us from slavery. Any of the last two Torah portions that we've been reading would have been great to just show God has a unique relationship with the Jewish people. That's why he took us out of the land of Egypt. But look at chapter 14, verse number 1. You are children of the Lord your God. You shall not gash yourselves or shave the front of your heads because of the dead. That's the verse to show that Jews have a special relationship. I know, of all the things, you shouldn't gash yourselves. I was once, I was a religion major in college. I loved studying world religions. I was invited to go to a performance of whirling dervishes. You probably know more about this than I do. But apparently the dervishes have a custom where not only do they dance like this, but they bang their heads. And it causes it to swell, and then they take a very sharp knife and they give a little cut and it comes down. I was like, no thanks, I'll pass on seeing the dervishes tonight. Because I wanted to see the dancing, but I didn't want to see the blood part. So that's what they're talking about. But look at the note at the bottom of the page. As children of God, each of us has infinite value, even if the absence of the loved one has died. Nonetheless, it diminished the worth of an individual bearer of single of God when we become so attached to someone else. No, that's not.
No, I think you're looking at the one where it says holiness and mourning.
You shall not gash.
See number 1 on top of the line?
No. You see on the right side where it says, you shall not gash yourselves. The sages, basing their comment on a play on words, uses this verse to demand that we not bicker amongst ourselves as a community, dividing into sects. Now why did Rabbi Akiva choose this? Now it makes more sense. Why did Rabbi Akiva choose this? Right, but what's going on historically in his world, in his life?
All the different
The
sects
Karaites
of Judaism.
and the Sadducees.
Well, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are done.
Right.
Karaites aren't yet. They come to the 9th century.
the
But there was another Christian
The Essenes.
Jewish offshoot, right? Exactly.
Jesus.
There were all these different kinds of Jews. And what he's saying in 130 after the Common Era, which is after Paul's already gotten his land legs there, is we Jews have to stick together. And so he uses a verse that clearly separates us from the world around us, and to say that we Jews in this formula time of making Judaism need to stick together and not bicker with each other. Right.
Which now makes sense why he used Noah to say that we all come from the same thing, and let's stay together.
Right. Start from the universal, and then get to the particular.
Away.
Exactly. Concentric circles moving inward. Exactly. And that's why, by the way, when you study, it's so important to look at the verses. When they give the verses, for two reasons. Number one is that they are alluding to something bigger than what the verse itself says. And often in rabbinic, particularly in Talmudic literature, they only quote the beginning part of it, and sometimes the pithy part that you're looking for is actually not on the page. You have to actually know the rest of the verse to be able to do that. So when you're studying and you have these verses, it always pays to go and look and see them in terms of their context. So Israel is loved, for they are called the children of God. You are the children of Adonai your God. Israel is even more loved, because to them was given a kli chemda, translated here as a precious instrument. What's a kli mean? Anybody know what a kli is?
A vessel.
Vessel or a tool. A kli, you are given a precious tool, a precious instrument, not a musical instrument, a tool. That such a precious tool was given to them, was made known to them by a special love. For I have given you a good doctrine, forsake not my Torah. And the quote that he uses is not from Torah itself. It's from the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is found in the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is made up of 3 parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Proverbs is in the book of writings, purported to have been written by King Solomon. What does it mean, a precious instrument? What is that? The word kli to me implies a kli is a tool, and a tool is only useful when it's put into use. Right? You can have the most wonderful set of tools, but unless you learn how to use them, you are not handy. It's like David Brenner used to joke that when he was a kid, his mother would stand over his crib with a hammer in one hand and book in the other, and say, "You were a Jewish boy. Book good, hammer bad."
Who said that?
Yeah. So you are a precious instrument. A precious instrument was given to them to be used for this sacred purpose, was made unto them by a special love, for I have given you a good doctrine, forsake not my Torah. Ki lecha tov natati lachem, Torati al ta'azovu. Which, as I mentioned, and I mentioned it, but I really wanted to point out to you, if you open up your Siddur to page 77, I just wanted you to get this passage in context, because this is also important in understanding how Judaism, how the system really works. So, one of the challenges with one, and this is the end of every single time we put the Torah back, Shabbos weekdays we sing Ki Lekach Tov and Eitz Chaim Hi. Eitz Chaim Hi is one of those songs you kind of know by heart from the Torah service. But and unfortunately, one of the challenges with this Siddur, as opposed to a book like the Art Scroll Siddur, is this one doesn't give you the references to where it is, because what you find out is that the Siddur is actually a compendium of all different kinds of biblical verses used in different contexts than they were originally put into the Torah or into the Bible itself. And so one of the ways that the holy documents became sacred was by putting them into liturgy, by making them part of the process of prayer. And so, what it translates, what is translated here, for I have given you a good doctrine, do not forsake my Torah, is that first life, precious teaching I gave you, never forsake my Torah. Eitz Chaim Hi is a tree of life for those who grasp onto it, and all who uphold it are blessed. Its ways are pleasant, and all the paths of peace. Help us to return to you, Adonai. We shall return, renew our lives as in days of old. And as we say, as days of old, that's when the ark is closed. Now, see, it's fascinating to my mind, and we don't know how this came about. Who sat down and said, when we put the Torah back, our most precious possession, here's what we should say. Who was the editor who picked this verse from Proverbs and this verse from Eitz Chaim is also from Proverbs. The line Eitz Chaim is from Proverbs 3:18 and 17. And then the last verse, help us to turn to you, Adonai, and we shall return, renew our lives as the days of old. That's from the book of Lamentations. Anybody know the book of Lamentations? Probably not, because it's from Tisha B'Av, which is the holiday of summer. It happens in August when most people are down the shore. If I did Tisha B'Av in Margate, I think I'd have a lot bigger of a crowd. Anyhow, so Lamentations was written by Jeremiah, who witnessed the destruction of the first temple. Why does Rabbi Akiva reference this phrase that was probably part of the Torah service in his day? He takes the Jeremiah who lived through the first temple and juxtaposes it with him who lived through the second temple to say, just as Judaism went on after the destruction of the first temple, it will always continue. And when we close the ark, that's what we're saying. We're saying no matter what's going on in the world around us, Judaism will always continue. And then we put the Torah back, and then we continue on with the service, with the rest of the service. Anyhow, I thought that was just a fascinating insight into the way that Jewish liturgy works by taking the biblical sources and embedding them in the Siddur itself. Questions, comments? Yes,
you said the image in Hebrew is Shem.
No, it's Sel. Selem is the Tzadik, Tzadik Lamed Mem, and it comes from the root Sel, Tzadik Lamed, which means a shadow. Image, shadow, you can kind of see that it's the derivation is similar. One of the most fun things, sometimes I am envious of people who just get to sit around and study and somebody pays them to do that. Because right? They're just taking the books off the shelf to prepare for this class. It was fun. And so there's a dictionary, the most famous dictionary, the most comprehensive, is sort of the Webster's Dictionary of Hebrew is called Evan Shoshan. And so if you go and you look up the root, Sale, and you can follow all of the all of the ways that the derivatives of how the word, the language works. It's fantastic.
Matzlema is Hebrew for camera.
Right, from the
Matzlema.
word sail, right, also.
I was thinking of the English word image. I was thinking, well, I think of imagine, maybe God imagine. So I was thinking
The linguistic connections are fantastic. In fact, it plays right into, and although I will tell you now, we're only going to study about 5 minutes of the next Mishnah, but the next Mishnah is extremely, extremely difficult to understand, not only because it starts out with the idea that God foresees everything, and yet God gives us free will. Right, that's tough. This just starts. So if you turn the page, and I'm only going. We're going to launch into it just with the language derivative because Karen, you brought it up. The next Mishnah is taught by Rabbi Akiva, and it's very extremely short. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 words. But there's so much in here. I just wanted to begin. We'll take a quick look at the Mishnah on page 46. All is foreseen, yet free choice is given. And by God's goodness, the world is judged, yet all things follow the larger portion of human acts. I know you recognize all those words, but not strung together in the way that they are. I understand that. I have spent a long time unpacking this, and I'll just share a little bit with you. But the first, if all is foreseen, then what good is free choice?
But we don't know what it is.
Right. Right, except that if all is foreseen, if all is already known, what's the difference? What's the difference whether you do the good thing or the bad thing? Right? If all is foreseen, that essentially God already knows the outcome. There is no free choice.
But God
involved.
gives you.
Involved in the word though the reason I wanted to bring, and I'm going to sort of crack this paradox, except that I will tell you that in hours and hours of research, all of the great minds, of which mine is a peanut by comparison, have a heck of a hard time figuring this out and coming up with other than it's God's way. Or you come up with horrible things like, yes, the suffering was all for a reason, and that's why innocent people have to die because it's part of God's greater plan, etc. It goes into moral territory that some rabbis are comfortable with, not this one. But the reason I wanted to point it out in particular, and Yafa, you'll appreciate this, is, and soon everybody, Hakol Safui. All is Safui. That's an interesting word, Safui. Safui is the same word as, not sushi, as Tatspit. Safui. A Tatspit is an overlook. Anybody who's traveled in Israel, you go to those overlooks where, like in the Golan Heights, and you can see into Lebanon, a Tatspit. In other words, it implies that God is sitting in this high place watching us. So it might not be, and as the Rashi comment is listed here, it might not be the whole thing is foreseen as in foretold, as in God knows the outcome ahead of time, but that God sees all of it, right? Which sits a lot better because then there's accountability. If God is watching and therefore your deeds are being recorded, obviously your decisions truly matter. All is foreseen, yet free choice is given. Free choice here meaning that we have the ability as human beings to shape our own lives and our own destiny. I had an interesting conversation. I was teaching around this table last night, a group of high school kids, and I was dealing with them, teaching them, and I made the statement that happiness is a choice. To which one 10th grader raised his hand and politely but stridently disagreed. He said happiness is an emotion. And just like you can't tell me not to be afraid of dogs, you can't tell me to be happy. And we went back and forth on this. But that, and by the way, I think he's wrong. I think that people can be trained not to be afraid of dogs. And that people can control their own thought life to make happier, to focus on happier things. It might be hard. But as Maimonides points out here, free choice is the bedrock of Jewish life. And in particular, who he was fighting against when Rambam made that comment was astrologers. astrology has very, very often been the enemy or sort of the antipathy of Jewish life. And I was reading it, and as I was studying this last night, I was thinking about astrologers. How many of you know the sign that you are? Right? Everybody. I'm an Aquarius. So there will be people who will say, oh, you're an Aquarius, your characteristics are A, B, C, and D. Which, if you think about it, is the antithesis of free will. In a certain sense, right, if you're born under a sign, you're not making the decisions about the kind of person you are. You were already born into that. And as my mom is saying, what Akiva is saying here is that's not true. We all have unlimited potential and can be the kind of people that we want to be, which is why God gave us this precious gift called the Torah, the special Kli Chemdah, so that we could make our lives through conscious thought, through decisions, through reflection, through the gifts that God gives only to humanity, into being the kind of people ultimately that we want. So all is foreseen, meaning God watches the decisions we make, but the decisions that we make are ultimately up to us as individuals. And so that's where where Rabbi Akiva is coming from. And it also made me just so wary. It's so interesting to me that 2,000 years ago, our tradition was worried about astrology, and still nobody gets. It's not in the newspaper. Is it? I don't get the Inquirer anymore. Let me get the Inquirer. Is
every day.
Is astrology? Is the astrology still in there?
I read it every day.
You read it every day. Right.
If it's a good one, I remembered. If it's a good one,
well, thank you.
So that's her choice.
I guess that is in fact free choice. But in a certain sense, what this statement undermines is predestination. The decisions of the path of our lives are very much up to us by the decisions that we make, the people we associate with, the things that would occupy our thought life. All of those factors help us to shape because without free choice, without free will, then the whole idea, the entire system of being good is undermined.
But this doesn't answer the ultimate question: why do bad things happen to good people?
Right, exactly. That's why I said. I'll tell you in a long time. I can't. Right. There are several different ways of answering. We'll get into next way. But how, as Harold Kushner said, it seems from his perspective impossible to have an all-knowing God and an all-powerful God who is good.
Right.
You can't have all three of those things.
Because God wouldn't
I
want to
wanted to talk
witness
about
the
reasons.
bad. Because God wouldn't want to witness the terrible stuff.
Well, right. If God is all-powerful, then everything that happens is a result of God's will. But some of the things are clearly not good. So unless we say, we'll never be able to understand it, it's only from God's perspective.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Right, exactly. Which means it's
You
unknown.
don't know what good means.
Which means it's unknown. But if we don't know what good means, then the last part of this makes no sense at all. Because by goodness the world is judged. If we don't know what good is, but we're being judged on goodness, that's not fair either. To have a whole system, a whole criterion of judging us and then not telling us what that system is, that's not fair. Tell me the rules and I'll choose to embrace them or ignore them, but you can't hold me responsible for laws I had no idea. If I can't define what good is, and in somebody's idea good is murdering children, and in some it's building orphanages, all bets are off. You can't.
But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that more of what you said before, that what looks bad to us, we don't know the end game.
Right.
And so we don't know if somehow, like Gamzu Latova, this is also for the good.
Right.
What good can come out of it?
Right. No, I agree. Right. They forgot to call you with your alarm, and you missed the plane, and the plane crashed. So obviously, it was. I don't know how to make sense out of that part, but I do know how to make sense of and we're going to pick it up with here next time. By goodness, God judges the world. I understand a couple of different ways of dealing with that, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. Like I said, we're not meeting again, I think, until the 21st of February. I'm going to be away for a little bit, and some time off. So yeah, if you'll push the button, please. Hopefully you'll record it.